If you're a toy collector or even just a moderate toy enthusiast, you know there's a lot of Conan the Barbarian action figures out there. We've had Conan figures made for decades. And you probably also know that there's a lot of different He-Man figures out there. And I'm not just talking about the different lines, but even different variants within a line. So, yeah, it's pretty obvious why He-Man and Conan have been compared for years. Some saying one is a ripoff of the other, some saying that one is a thinly veiled, disguised recreation. Well, I want to kind of give a definitive answer because after some new research and really looking at some case history, you can kind of figure this out. Now, the difference between Conan and He-Man is, well, for starters, Conan has black hair and He-Man has blonde hair, and that tends to be a lot of the argument with people with He-Man's blonde hair, except for, when he doesn't have blonde hair, then suddenly he becomes a Conan ripoff, right? And why is it that so many Conan action figures look like they could be part of a Masters of the Universe toy line? And likewise, why are there so many He-Man action figures that look like they could be part of a Conan toy line? Well, the obvious thing is they're both barbarian-themed based, but that doesn't satisfy the need for that definitive answer. Now, I can absolutely have the qualifications that I am a, sort of an expert on the Masters of the Universe brand, having brand managed it for years, but my knowledge of Conan tends to be a little bit more limited. I do remember reading some of the comic books in the sort of early 90s, and of course, who can forget the Schwarzenegger film from the mid-1980s. And that tends to be the cultural sort of vantage point, as well as, of course, as I said, all of the toys. You can't go to a comic book store, a toy show, or, well, basically anyone's private toy collection with at least finding one Conan toy somewhere, and they have ranged all the way from the wacky to the weird to the book accurate to the movie accurate but turned to stone because you need a different variant to sell at a convention. But, you get what I mean. Some of them look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, some of them look like the artwork, some of them just look like an interpretation of the stories. I have to applaud McFarlane, actually, for doing figures based on a very specific Conan story. And that actually brings me to exactly my point. Almost every company has done this, except for Mattel. Or have they? Did Mattel actually make a Conan the Barbarian action figure and release it in a Masters of the Universe line? I wanted to find out. So, to start, I needed to learn a lot more about Conan. I knew a lot about He-Man, but again, Conan, slightly limited. And by starting with the books, I quickly realized that the paperbacks were rearranged by L. Spruce de Camp in the 1960s, and they didn't really represent Robert Howard's actual original text as published in Weird Tales magazine throughout the 1930s. So, of course, I did what everyone else does, and I went on YouTube and found out that the best version is the Complete Chronicles hardback. So when eBay purchased later, and I had my 1,000 pages of Conan text to read, which I did. And that now, I think, makes me at least qualified to discuss both brands a little bit more fully. After all, it's not just the hair color that separates them, but their relationship with Mattel is more murky than people actually realize. There is a connection between the movie Conan the Barbarian and the Masters of the Universe toy line, and it's, well, kind of like Madeline with two N's and a Y. It's not quite where you think or what you think. It wasn't that He-Man was a reinterpretation or a ripoff of Conan, but rather He-Man was created independently. And looking at some of the concept art that we know was created specifically for the He-Man line, you can see images that look like the final product, and you can see concept figurines that show the full breadth of the idea. It was one of several presented at the Hacienda Hotel in 1979, ironically, right across the street from the current Mattel headquarters. One of those people who presented was Roger Sweet, a Mattel designer, and his concept was the He-Man trio. It was up against other concepts. There was a Robin Hood concept, and there was even a Mini World and Big World concept shown, which ironically wound up getting incorporated into Masters of the Universe towards the tail end, but that's a YouTube video for another time. The brand that did become Masters of the Universe, which was presented by Roger Sweet as the He-Man trio, obviously started off very different, and many, many, many talented artists and marketers and writers over the years have contributed. But if you look directly at his original three-figure concept, it was more like a male Barbie, where it was one character that could do anything, military, space. If it was translated directly to a toy, it probably, well, it literally did look like this. It's not very recognizable as He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. So yes, while Roger Sweet's trio was the foundation, other designers at Mattel did things like shrink it to 5 inches, so it wouldn't be quite the 12-inch figures shown, but would still tower over others. All right, now what about Conan? As far as the connection between Masters and Conan, no, Masters was not a reinterpretation of it. And again, it's not just because He-Man has blonde hair. He-Man has blonde hair for a very specific reason. So the He-Man trio is presented as a male stereotype or archetype, shall we say, that could space, military, barbarian. That was developed independently of the group that was looking at the Conan script. It is true that Mattel did review the Conan script, and it is historically accurate that Mattel licensed Conan with the original intent of making Conan the Barbarian action figures based on the Schwarzenegger film. It's how movie merchandise, pays for it. Just, check out Spaceballs. They have a whole great scene explaining that. And the thing is, though, Mattel didn't make a Conan line. They, as, Zoe Winkler's father would say, sat on it, or sit on it. They sat on it, past tense. It's kind of like how movie studios will sometimes license a script with the intention of not making it, just so it doesn't wind up with another studio. Now, obviously, Mattel passed on Conan officially because of the sex and the violence that was in the content. It wasn't right for a child's toy line. Just talk to the RoboCop line about that. But they also had independently developed Masters of the Universe as part of that brainstorm at the Hacienda Hotel. While He-Man started off as a character for any type of environment, he wound up being a barbarian. And while, again, people look at the brown-haired Wonder Bread, not Wonder Bread actually, but the promotion figure, it was a buy two, get one free figure where He-Man had brown hair as, proof that it used to be Conan. Well, no, the relationship, one was independent at, two different facilities, but Mattel changed He-Man's hair to blonde so it would match Ray Wagner, the CEO, the president at the time, even though he had gray hair by then, but, traditionally blonde. So that's why He-Man got blonde hair, was to basically make a presentation that would kind of sort of suck up to the CEO. They're like, hey, we kind of tried to make his face look like you, Mr. Wagner. It's basically what they were doing. So sitting on the Conan license was because, one, they had already developed He-Man, which was now going with a barbarian theme, but two, they wanted to prevent any other competitor from now coming out with a line that would compete with He-Man. And the Conan name and brand recognition would technically allow a competitive toy company to quickly put out a barbarian line that would use the same shapes and structures as He-Man, and lo and behold, companies did do this, and there were lawsuits, lots of lawsuits, and Mattel actually lost all of them because it was found that you can't copyright a stance, if you will. And of course, one of the companies making He-Man-esque figures did make Conan figures. Not based on the movie, they couldn't get the license rights because those were with Mattel, more on that in a minute, but they could make them based on the original stories. And to say these Conan figures look like He-Man figures is an understatement. In fact, Conan could just even be mistaken for He-Man in sort of a reverse angle of this entire story. So, crazier things have happened. All right, so aside from the ability to create generic barbarian warriors using a Masters of the Universe-esque body type, which was found to be in the public domain, or at least not trademarkable by the legal system, it all brings us back to this image. So for years, this image has been talked about as part of one of the very early concepts of He-Man by Mark Taylor. It paired very nicely with an early concept of Skeletor and was incorporated, by yours truly and the Four Horsemen into the Motu Classics line as Vicor, the barbarian He-Man, in a way to do concept art figures as legitimate characters, kind of like the McQuarrie concept figures sold in the Star Wars line, but instead of calling them concept figures, our goal was to make them marketable characters that could appear in content and could be sold. Hence, he is now Vicor, a independent character, not just called Concept Art He-Man or, McQuarrie Concept Han Solo. All right, but Now to shed a little bit more light and what really is the heart of the matter, I went back and I reread through all of the legal documents between the lawsuits between Universal and Mattel. And it turned out the lawsuits, when you actually go through, really clarify that what this was about was not that He-Man was a ripoff, but that Mattel did option the property and deliberately sat on it in order to not create competition for their own He-Man line. It may not have been what their original intent was, but with the license now in their portfolio, they had the ability to not make Conan toys. And the infamous sketch by Mark Taylor, it looks like, was actually made during the brief time Mattel was considering making an actual Conan line. And this image, which for years has been talked about as being a concept image of He-Man, may indeed be Mark Taylor's Conan image used while Mattel was developing a Conan line before they decided to sit on the license to prevent others from putting out a Conan line, and because the movie was too violent and too sexual for a children's line. Again, talk to RoboCop and Aliens and all the other R-rated 80s toy lines out there, but that's not important right now. The point being is that Conan and He-Man are clearly intermixed, but I hope this video at least clarifies how the action figures can look like each other. A He-Man as Conan or a Conan as He-Man, it's all barbarian fun to me. I hope this video acted as that sort of definitive look at what that weird connection was between the two brands back in the 80s. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do leave a comment below and share it with others. It's the best way to support the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.